Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this working session on building resilience and sustainable regional and global value chains through the African Free Trade Agreement that has recently been established, AfCFTA. My name is Sheila Agarwal Khan. I'm the Director of the Economy Division at the UN Environment Programme, and I'm pleased to co-host this session together with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, ODI, and TESS. At UNEP, we see this as a real priority in our work. It's one of our key pillars where we're working to help countries with several partners that can, At UNEP, we see this as a key priority to be able to help countries develop capacities that can really harness the opportunities that environment and trade can bring together. Today, we're going to see from many panel members how we can explore this opportunity better. We've seen in this last year and a half with COVID, the fragility of Africa's supply chains. And now is a chance to look to seeing how to develop more resilient and sustainable value chains. It's an opportunity to build back better as we transition towards greener economies, especially in a context where several countries across the globe are moving towards a more greener economy and looking at how to be able to use trade and environment in ways that harness each other to build back better, to grow jobs, to grow economies. It also presents an opportunity for the African continent to be able to harness common positions for the Climate Change Convention, for the WTO, etc. So we will start today with a 15-minute presentation from the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and then we will go to our panel members. And we'll have a few questions, and then we'll open the floor to seeing if there are questions from the panel. So let me first introduce our panel. We have Stephen Karingi, who is the Director of Regional Integration and Trade at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome, Stephen. We have three panelists. Dr. Maximiliano Mendez Parra, Principal Research Fellow at ODI. We have Ambassador Usha Dwarka Kanabadi, the Perm Rep from Mauritius to the UN offices in Geneva. And we have Dr. Hermogene Nsengimana, Secretary General at the African Organization for Standardization. So let me hand the floor to Mr. Stephen Karingi of the UN Economic Commission for Africa to lead us through a presentation on the opportunities and challenges that we see in leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Agreement for the region. Over to you, Mr. Karingi.
Oh, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much, Sheila. Please allow me not to put on my video because we are having difficulties with connectivity as there is no power where I'm working. So I'm using very low bandwidth. But I hope I'll be able to pass a few messages to set us up. So if you allow me, I'm going to share some slides that I wanted to introduce as part of my introduction to this session. And again, hopefully, I'll be able to go through it without too much of a problem. Now, as we have heard from Sheila, COVID-19 has actually shown us the fragility of our supply chains, indicating that we need to do things differently, even in the face of the climate shock changes that we are facing. Now, the good news for Africa is that we have a continental agreement in the area of trade, which promises to change the production structure and even the trade structure of the continent, within the continent, and also with the rest of the world. It offers an opportunity for us to ask the question, is it possible to use the free trade area, that is the AfCFTA, to tackle the challenges of climate change as Africa builds forward better? Now, you'll see, at least most of you now that because a lot of people in Geneva are familiar with this, for Africa, most of the exports with the rest of the world tends to be from the extractives. And the exports of Africa to the rest of the world that is manufactured is only 20% or lower. Conversely, the trade patterns within the continent, most of the trade is of manufactured goods. And what is traded in terms of extractives within the continent is only 25%. So as you can see, the AfCFTA does actually offer the opportunity to take advantage of this deep manufacturing trade that is taking place within the continent to see whether there is a story of a positive story of how to deal with the climate issue. Now, so based on most of the work we have done here at the ECA, we just concluded a new empirical analysis of what the AfCFTA means both for growth, for incomes, and also for trade. And we are currently looking at what it means for inequality and poverty. Basically, there is a positive story that the AfCFTA promises. But we also know, given the challenge of climate change, there is a risk that the AfCFTA will face in its ability to deliver on all those positive gains. We give an example there. Comparative advantages are going to shift within countries and between countries, within regions and between regions. The infrastructure which exists today that would facilitate this trade is going to have huge impacts from climate change. And that is why having a well-managed climate change policies present opportunities, not only of expanding the potential of trade under the AfCFTA, but also allowing the member states to use the AfCFTA to mitigate and also to adapt to climate change. Now, at the moment, we have started doing some work on the strategic environmental analysis of the AfCFTA. And the two key questions that are being asked from this strategic analysis is, one, how can the AfCFTA design take account of these trends in African countries? And two, how can the AfCFTA decide build a more resilient and greater continent? So you have this loop, which we believe can actually be taken advantage of in terms of using the AfCFTA to address climate change, and also in dealing with climate change, optimizing on the AfCFTA. So let me, in the second part, take us through just to let you know where we are with this strategic environmental analysis. And you will see its importance as I go to the third part. The first part is to say that we've started this work. We've already had a scoping report. We had a very successful consultative meeting with stakeholders in the environmental and trade arena, including experts and also policymakers. And we are currently drafting and conducting stakeholder interviews. We hope that between this month and next month, we'll have a validation workshop, and hopefully some of you who are listening to us will have an opportunity to come to listen to what is coming out, and we will be able to launch this report in February. In the medium term, we might be able to make some presentations during the event at the COP. So the objectives of the strategic environmental analysis of the AfCFTA, just like any strategic environmental analysis of a major policy issue or a major investment, we basically want to understand the environmental and climate change constraints and opportunities, to evaluate the net effects, environmental impacts of the AfCFTA, and what that means for policy trade-offs. Also try to identify whether there are entry points for incorporating environmental considerations into the AfCFTA implementation, considering that environmental considerations were not a major variable that negotiators had to discuss under the phase 1 mandate, and also try to see whether maybe the phase 2 issues and phase 3 issues of the AfCFTA could provide some basis for these environmental considerations to be discussed. Also assess the institutional capacities at the continental, regional, and national level to address those environmental considerations, and then, of course, address its feasibility. Now, very quickly, just to reiterate, there was no political mandate for environmental provisions in the agreement. That is the phase 1 agreement, even for the phase 2 and phase 3 going on. But we know, of course, for some countries like the US and the EU, they do normally have a political mandate to have environmental consideration. So essentially, our strategic environmental analysis will raise awareness on the importance of mainstreaming environmental considerations into the AfCFTA. And of course, we hope to be able to do that through a strong evidence-based, clear policy briefs and advocacy events that essentially we believe will allow us to use the AfCFTA, if not now, moving forward as a framework to develop a common African position on trade and environmental sustainability discussions at the WTO. Now, just to give you an example how this can happen, already under the phase 1 issues, we have the protocol in goods and protocol in services already done. So as members finalize their tariff schedules, one could actually look at, are they putting things that are critical to environmental well-being, are they being put under the sensitive and exclusion lists? Already, our analysis suggests that this is not the case. In the area of trade and services, there are 5 priority sectors that have been agreed for services liberalization. 2 of them, that is transport and tourism, are important entry points for incorporating environmental considerations. And so as countries make their commitment offers, that's something that they can look at. On standards and homogeneous here from ASO, African countries, we believe, should prioritize the harmonization and the strengthening of environmental standards and regulation under the Pan-African Quality Insurance Agenda, and also in the area of the LTVs. These are the phase 2 issues, and I think, like I said previously, they do provide an opportunity, be it in the IP or in the competition policy or investment or in e-commerce. There are opportunities for one to be able to integrate matters that could lead to better environmental outcomes. Take the case of investments. Through the investment protocol, a regulatory convergence on investments can actually help develop common African incentives that facilitate investment in green-friendly research and development, and also in technologies, and also in infrastructure. Now, moving on, basically the recommendation so far that is coming out is that the member states should assess the environmental impact that could result from increased economic and trade activities under the agreement, determine how risks related to climate change could alter the comparative advantages and trade patterns, because that's important for member states moving forward. You may make an offer in an area that your comparative advantage is going to change because of climate change. Also, the member states need to examine how the agreement can help promote production and trade of goods and services that are essential to tackling environmental and climate change challenges, and of course, guide on how natural resources can be best utilized to develop regional value chains that support the advancement for both green and pro-economy agendas. Very quickly, because I think this public forum enables us to show what is going on. We have some collaboration with other partners. We are doing research on modeling the interactions between climate change and the AfCFTA. We are doing this with a think tank in Paris, and we have already concluded some work also with ODI on the same agenda. We're also looking at green value chain analysis. In the capacity building under our Africa Trade Policy Center, we are going to have an ATPC environmental management plan and staff capacity building so that ATPC staff are also well versed as we advance the agenda for the mainstreaming environmental considerations in the AfCFTA, and of course for technical assistance, working with the institutions even like UNCTAD, and hopefully more with UNEP, we can be able to look at how do we green the AfCFTA strategies that we are helping member states with. So essentially, this is our plan. We hope that we can conclude by phase 3, whereby we have an alignment of the African Union green recovery policy with the AfCFTA. GRAP is basically an AU-led initiative that is informing the African position as we move to the COP26. But we also know that the AfCFTA is something that is ongoing. So we believe that it's possible for us to align a lot of the commitments that the African countries are going to make as informed by GRAP to what they do in the area of the AfCFTA. Of course, under the phase 1, we know trade and greenhouse gas emissions link in Africa are also going to be critical to the whole conversations that we are hearing, or at least that we are familiar with from an empirical point of view on the carbon border adjustment measures. And so as ECA, we are also working in trying to understand this in details and their policy implications as we move forward. So this is basically what the Green Recovery Action Plan of the African Union, what it intends to do. It has priority areas in climate finance, renewable energy, climate resilient agriculture. And on the other side, we know under the AfCFTA what has been agreed already. And so the references on renewable energy, nature-based solutions, and biodiversity, resilient agriculture, these are areas that the AfCFTA and GRAP could be brought together. We already have some case studies that are ongoing for Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. So thank you very much, Sheila. I hope at least I've been able to put some points that can inform the panel as we go forward, despite the difficulties that I have with my connectivity.
Thank you, Stephen. That was lovely. And I think we'll be coming back to you with some questions as we proceed in the panel. I'd like to turn over to Mr. Mendes-Para. I think the screen has to switch off from where you are.
Yeah, that's what I'm actually trying to do. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah, there.
Okay, good. Mr. Mendes-Para, could you tell us maybe a little bit from ODI's perspective, what opportunities and challenges does the African Free Trade Agreement offer in terms of opportunities and challenges for tackling climate change in the continent?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, and of course, good afternoon to everyone that is in the call. Well, I think that this is critical question because as we see it, I mean, Africa in particular is in a sort of challenge that I think that is unique. I think it's the first time that we are asking, actually, the Africa is asking to its population as well, to the continent, actually, on basically transforms its economy, achieve economic development, but at the same time is the demand that actually that this has to be done within the boundaries of the carbon budget. So basically, it's a constraint that other regions didn't have in the past when they transformed their economies. I mean, Southeast Asia didn't have to look that much on basically on the climate aspect, but this is something that the world is asking Africa. And if we take the consideration, the challenge now, basically in terms of the value chains that Africa is part is Africa is in general is participating in global value chains from as a provider of raw materials, and also as intermediate goods, and in general through the reliance of forward linkages in those value chains. And that puts Africa in general in a vulnerable situation with respect to how vulnerable they are to shocks, particularly on the climate side. So I think that the diversification that is in general a sort of a typical strategy of risk management is what is the call. What we think is that this is coming through not necessarily disengaging from the global value chains, but actually through the development of regional value chains that can be developed in Africa. And this is something that, of course, came too much on the discussion during the pandemic, but I think the discussion has to go further as a sort of a development strategy that considers first, I mean, in terms of the development strategy in itself, and of course, in terms of the environmental and climate implications of that. So I think that the AfCFTA in particular is the instrument that will be critical, and it is critical for the development of those value chains. And I think there is something very interesting, what Stephen was mentioned right at the beginning, is the characteristic of the structural, the differences between the trade within Africa and the trade outside Africa, where basically within Africa, we are talking about a more manufacturer base, more services oriented base trade. Extra Africa tend to be the more traditional based on natural resources and agricultural products. And this is where we need to start thinking of how the trade and climate angle plays. And I think that there are some good or good news there when we start analyzing, for example, the evolution of trade versus the evolution of territorial emissions of Africa in the last 20 years, where actually trade has grown, but at a substantially higher rate than the growth of environmental emissions. And that has led to a reduction of the content of emissions in the African exports, a substantial reduction per unit, which is encouraging because at the same time, you have this sort of transition towards a more manufacturer intra-Africa oriented. So one of the questions that it needs to answer is whether that intra-Africa trade, that more manufacturer-based oriented trade is compatible with a climate agenda. That is critical, something to consider. Still something to discuss, but the science points that this is the case, in which case the AfCFTA will not only be climate compatible, but it could be potentially something that the continent may contribute to the global effort of reduction of emissions and the address of the environmental dimensions. And there are clearly opportunities, and many of those were mentioned by Stephen, specifically on the provisions of the agreement. There is clearly the situation of the tariff liberalization, the schedules of reductions, where there is the need of potentially, it would be a question of whether it's possible to reopen the negotiations there, to potentially actually exclude it from the list of sensitive goods or goods to be excluded from liberalization, precisely those environmental goods that we want that they have a lower tariff and low restrictions to trade. This is something that needs to be discussed because it is essential on the discussion. The same on the services, where services is part, services, environmental services is part of the negotiations, but there are other elements specifically on the current phase 2 negotiations, specifically on the investment, where the investment protocol is expected to be quite based on sustainable development aspects, and the environmental element would be there. So it's a potentially possibility of how we can bring those elements into the investment protocol. As saying within the intellectual property rights, where there is a discussion on the try to balance between facilitate the transfer of green technologies, but at the same time protecting the development of those green technologies within the continent. That is something that will need to be probably considered. The other point is that is an opportunity that needs to be discussed is how the AfCFTA may create an adequate framework for the development of an African carbon market. I think that this is an important element, because it will also facilitate African firms to trade with other regions that may increasingly bring in border carbon adjustments, etc. We're actually having a carbon market may facilitate that sort of exports. And of course, I mean, on the aspects associated with harmonized and threatening standards, specifically environmental standards, is something that is something to discuss. Of course, it is something I'm going to extend much, because I think probably the next speaker will probably talk a bit more of that. Finally, there are two main blocks I think that need to be considered. The first is the barriers to the climate action that could be there. And this is in a sense, I think that this is a limited understanding of the climate risk, lack of knowledge, and a lack of supported policies that may exist in many of the African countries. And this is something that is important to consider. And of course, the financial dimension that all these changes will need to bring that. So these are potentially the two significant roadblocks, but I think that, in my opinion, these are areas that are not easy, but I think that there are solutions to address them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maximiliano. I want to come first to Dr. Nsengimana, because you talked a bit about standards, and the African Organization for Standards would be a good point here to hear in terms of what kind of standards do you think need to come in that could really support resilient and sustainable value chains?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. When we did actually the need on standards for environment, the first thing that came out was on agriculture, sustainability standard in the agriculture sector, fisheries, tourism, and forestry. Those were the major ones. Now the other coming in are on energy and mining. Why the agriculture and the fisheries? When you look at the continent, actually we rely on those products, but the value added product is not there. We are trading in commodity, as what Stephen was talking about. But when you look at the standard that we have currently, you touch on issues of environment, you touch on social issues and economic issues. When you look at economic issues, this is standard bring in the benefit of sharing the revenue, the benefit of creating a need of belonging, that you belong to that value chain. When you look at the environment, the same way that you start feeling that all of us are together, are protecting the system together. On social, there are issues of gender, there are issues of labor law, there are issues of child protection that are coming in. But most importantly, what we found out, because many companies since 2018 have been certified on EcoMark Africa from actually 7 countries currently, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, Zambia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Some are in tourism, others are in agriculture, others are in fisheries. And recently, actually, Cote d'Ivoire came in, Senegal and Togo on sustainability for cocoa industry. This gave us an example where the farmers themselves from the cocoa industry actually requested the African Organization for Standardization that there is a need of this sustainability standard. And the main challenge, as you know, on sustainability standard is demand driven, it's consumer driven, is importing country driven. When we started this process, it was like Africa doesn't need sustainability standard. Africa doesn't need a certification on sustainable issues. But today, we found out testimony actually that we are currently sharing in social media, that the companies are saying they increased their business by being certified Ecomark Africa. Lastly on that, it's the cost. The cost of auditing, the cost in the certification process was very high because the institution, the certification body dealing with sustainability standard were coming from either Europe, either America, and all that costs in the traveling of those experts coming for auditing are all together in the cost of what the company is going to pay. Now they can utilize the certification body from the Bureau of Standard that are licensed to utilize the Ecomark Africa. I think that is very important. And maybe one last comment on this is the issue that also Stephen touched on, the e-commerce. The information technology now our expert has started now to put in the information and technology. How can you ease the process using the e-commerce now in your trading process as another sustainable way of doing business? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nsingimana. I wanted to maybe switch a little bit the gear to the case of a single country, Mauritius. Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi, could you tell us maybe a little bit about Mauritius in terms of the kind of steps or the incentives that Mauritius has been putting in place to build back better, and what it means in terms of a green transition for Mauritius?
Thank you very much, Shayla. I'm not sure that this was what I was expected to talk about, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. I'm happy to share with you whatever I know about Mauritius and what we've been doing for economic recovery. I think on the issue of, first of all, we're talking about the post-pandemic situation. In a post-pandemic situation, you're looking at a number of responses that you would need to give, including the greening of it. Mauritius will be going in a very high-level delegation after a very long time to COP26 with 7 ministers and the Prime Minister himself. So I think it just goes to show you the commitment that we have towards contributing to the negotiations on the ground. In terms of greening, there are loads of things we have done. I'm not sure I can enumerate all of them right now, but INDC is something that we look at very regularly. Under SDGs, we're looking at greening and bluing. And in fact, if I can say this, can we stop just say greening all the time? Greening is important. It's greening and bluing. It's life underwater as well as life above water. We need to look at both together because we can't take things off from the ground and put them in the water. And then it spoils the environment also on that one. So in terms of achievements, I think we have come a long way in banning plastic bags, for example. Minor matters, but it makes a difference. And also, I think here, renewable energy is a big deal back home. You want to invest in renewable energy, you have a lot of incentives. This is something you can do. We're a small island. So we expect to reach there in 15 years or in 30 years, but probably much earlier than the target of 30 years on where we need to get. But if you would just allow me for a moment, Mauritius was also, of course, MOVE. We've tried other things, using, for example, deep ocean water applications to try and create, for example, for the hotel industry, air conditioning. The Japanese have been there, Hitachi has been there, others have come. This is still a project we're looking at. So we're looking at all the possible alternatives that can be to avoid using as much as possible fossil fuels. Bagasse is a big deal in Mauritius because we produce sugarcane and we use bagasse as a sort of raw material to do this. So we're producing ethanol now from sugar. So again, this is something that we're looking at as alternative biofuels, etc. But I think one of the dreams I would have had was to have a biobank in Mauritius, to be able to conserve a lot of the biodiversities. And in fact, I wanted to talk about this today from the perspective of AfCFTA. What is it that we're doing to be able to preserve that? If you would allow me just to move away one moment from Mauritius, and I'm happy to share a lot that we do both for the sea and the land. I wanted to ask you the question of how do we leverage finance to be able to meet the energy needs of Africa. What we know today in Africa is that there's some 600 million people who do not really have access to electricity. We have some 900 million people who don't even have access to clean cooking, fuel or energy sort of thing. So how do we leverage finance to be able to get out to Africa, including Mauritius? Mauritius is already looking at central power stations, for example, but we're a small island, so it's easier for us to cope with that situation, perhaps, or to find solutions than if you're such a very big country where distribution becomes a problem. Now, what I saw recently was that we would need like $70 billion a year for the next 15 years to green Africa. Where does the $70 billion come from? One of the things we saw from AfCFTA was that if we are now at 86% of the rules of origin. If we actually get there when we need to get there, we would be moving from 2% of world trade to 3% of world trade. And that would bring in itself an income of $70 billion, exactly the same figure that would come into Africa. So we need to look at this leveraging of finance where we get there. I saw something extraordinary which happened. We met with Mr. Wamkele about 2 weeks ago. He's a very bright young person who really wants to do things. I'm very impressed. And we talked about the sort of settlement system using local currencies. That in itself seems like a far cry from greening, and yet it is so important. The coming into being of this repository now, this regional settlement system, I think is going to save something like 5 billion in transaction costs. It will allow you to use your local currency to be able to trade, to buy electricity, to sell electricity. Selling electricity across the grid can be done in local currencies. Regional pooling of electricity becomes easier because you don't have that difficulty in payment. I think these are all important steps. AfCFTA also has a dispute settlement system. So any arguments or disputes you have in the region can be settled by that. I think these are elements that help. They also have general exceptions. But what do you need to do more than AfCFTA? You probably need to go to the African Union and then persuade people that these subsidies that are now given on fossil fuels, how do you get rid of that? We don't give subsidies back home in Mauritius. It's a small island likely to disappear. So you need to ask those questions about how do we take local decisions, national decisions that will then feed into the broader international decision or regional decision, continental decision of making Africa green. One thing I wanted us to look at, because I saw David Luke very interestingly was carrying out an assessment on the environmental implications of the AfCFTA. And I was really hoping that he would go a bit further and also look at the possibility of what is it that we as Africa put on the table in the negotiations on trade and environment when this is likely to come, to say this is what we need. We always tend to be in a sort of passive situation where we're taking proposals from the others. And even yesterday at the meeting, the question of trade and environment was raised as some emerging issue. It never has been. Article 20 of GATT has always been there from the tuna dolphin case. So the question is, what do we put on the table? And it struck me, it irritates me, it annoys me that people come and patent the genetic composition of our plants in Africa. Somebody should pay for that. These are the people who should be financing what we need as money to make Africa green. I mean, these are ideas that I would have wanted ECA to take forward, not simply make an assessment, but give us ideas on where we move forward in a likely to come trade negotiation on WTO. In Mauritius, we are thinking already of certain things. I can tell you that much. And I think we're trying to see, but for example, in our case, oceans, when you parcel out oceans to give to other countries for them to do forays, what is the component in there that's going to bring you funds for greening or for bluing? You need to look at that. It's got to be part of any business model that you do. There is also one thing I want to share is the EU partnership program, which I think is something, again, we're not looking closely enough at. We know that the EU has developed a partnership strategy for Africa and several pillars. One of them is the green part, is the environment. Now, EU is much ahead of everybody in terms of greening and in terms of technology for greening. So what is it that they can possibly do for Africa in terms of greening, especially under the AfCFTA, by bringing in innovative partnerships that also bring in technology and help us achieve this one? I don't know whether that answers your question exactly. It's not on Mauritius exactly. It's where Mauritius fits in the broader picture of AfCFTA and Africa generally. And I would also request ECA, if they could, when we're looking at studies, it's good to look at all the bigger countries and also look at the 5 or 6 small island states of Africa. You have a great person called Jean-Paul Adam there who knows a lot about this. So I think this is a person who could help us actually get to where we need to get. Thank you, Sheila, and I'm happy for the questions or more interaction.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's very helpful. And it, in fact, prods another question, which is, you talked about electricity, you talked about, how do you create a market on that side? And on the other hand, remove fossil fuel subsidies. I'd be interested in hearing from you, Dr. Nsingimana. What do you see as, how does that perspective that Usha brings mean for the kind of standards that would need to be coming into the African Free Trade Area Agreement?
I think it's very important to, first of all, note that standards are a cheaper way of transferring knowledge. When you compare standards, very much there, that's when you compare the knowledge in the standards where experts have been together and put on different technology, different views because they are scientifically driven. It's very cheap, it's low cost comparing with the patent, comparing with the IP that are involved. That's one, that the use of standard is very important. The other part is the certification process. When you are certified, the certification creates a culture of quality. We have the AfCFTA, but it doesn't mean that a state party that have ratified the AfCFTA will just accept your product because you are part of the AfCFTA. It means that we need to have quality product. And countries are also free to even require environmental requirement, part of the process of trade. When you look at the standard that we have and the EcoMark Africa certification that we have, being in agriculture, being in the fisheries, being in forestry, being in tourism, which is a big sector on service sector, you see that SMEs are in the center of those standards. The way the standards are done on the African continent, the experts took care of what we call a maturity model. A maturity model, look at the local market. You are bringing the quality of the SME at a lower level, that is trading probably at national level. Then you move forward to increase the quality in different area requirements now on the global level. A product can easily enter the regional value chain when you are certifying against this EcoMark Africa. Entering the regional value chain, it's the core part of the AfCFTA. We need this comparative advantage that Stephen was talking about. Yeah, if there is no comparative advantage, we cannot open up the regional value chain. We're gonna still be trading at the local level. It's very important that AfCFTA, all we are doing, we support the certification process at a very early age. Secondly, the procurement, public procurement. The governments have the right. They have the right to put in condition on public procurement on environmental issues. As some countries already have requested impact assessment, environmental impact assessment requirement, you can also request certification on the environmental issues. Lastly is information sharing. We don't share information. We don't know the deficit from one country's, the productivity of another countries, the needs in trade on the African continent. I believe that the Africa Observatory, Trade Observatory, and what also we have on standard area, Africa Trade Web Portal, will be also very key to this AfCFTA linking to the standard on environmental issues. Lastly, Sheila, allow me to mention that now our countries actually have discussed the Made in Africa guideline. Made in Africa guideline is a document that allows you to understand what are the requirements on quality issues, rules of origin, intellectual property issues, at the same time that you understand different areas of the requirements that you're gonna need. This is also a really clear document that will help the AfCFTA and help our countries to increase the intra-Africa trade that we saw is at very, very low levels, what Stephen has presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nsingimana. Mr. Mendes-Para, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what you see from the business side of things, from African businesses taking advantage of some of the opportunities that Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi spoke about in terms of electricity, in terms of what Mr. Nsingimana spoke about in terms of fisheries? How do you see the business sector coming in and taking advantage of all this?
Well, clearly the business sector at the end of the day is the one that does things, that trade things, that do everything that is trying to be addressed by any agreement or any policy. So I think that they are critical on that. And what I see generally is that there is clearly the resources in many African businesses to deal with this. And if you put this more in a wider context in terms of the transformation of the economies of the continent, you clearly see, for example, that there is a lot of companies in Africa that are already at the frontier in terms of technology, in terms of expertise, in terms of knowledge, in areas that go from a services sector, I mean, talking about business services, etc. Well, these are areas that clearly there is these capabilities. So the business is clearly there. There are significant challenges in terms of the transformation. So one may imagine, for example, when we are talking, and I think it was referenced earlier about the fossil fuel subsidies, there need to see how countries such as Nigeria or other countries that are relying on the production and the trade in oil are going to adjust towards a production, a trade structure that is not reliant on those products, that is going, its demand is going to fall because there are pressures globally for that to happen. I mean, so basically there is, we need to think how those countries are going to a transition towards a world economy and an African economy that's going to be less reliant on oil. And that is where you start thinking that the economic transformation is a must for these countries. That needs to happen, and it's going to happen anyway. The question is, what is that countries and the regions and the continent can do to guide this transition towards an area, towards landing in a place that is the one that is going to be contributing to those objectives. Clearly, I think that the business is ready for that. I think that they are clearly capability needs that need to be addressed, etc. But clearly, they are the basis for that to definitely happen. It is the question of putting the right tools, the right instruments to basically support that action.
Thank you very much. We have a question from the panel for Dr. Nsingimana. Is the ECOMAC standard, would you say that it is on par with standards such as fair trade or rainforest certification process? How do you see the alignment between those?
Thank you, Sheila. It's a very good question. Actually, what we are doing is benchmarking. It's benchmarking, like if I touch to the question, the fair trade already, we have signed an MOU to reduce the costs of certification. It's very important that if fair trade has a standard, which is more fair trade standard touch on social responsibility issues. But social responsibility is embedded in our standard on ECOMAC Africa, meaning we are able to sit as an expert, actually agree on which standard that if you are certified ECOMAC Africa, you don't need another certification. That's the benchmarking process that we are dealing with, and we are discussing with different other certification schemes. We approached the Rainforest Alliance, and we approached so many others. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And another question we have from the panel, which maybe Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi you could take, is while Dr. Nsingimana talked about the certification process, the question from the panel says, well, certification is quite expensive, and especially for women in Africa, this is really a barrier. From both Mauritius's perspective, but your own broader knowledge of the African opportunities in this agreement, what would you say as your advice going forward?
I'm just trying to think of a solution that we could possibly use. Yes, certification is expensive, and we need to be able to do it nonetheless because it's important for us. And I think, again, I come back to the question of leveraging finance. We need to be able to find ways of leveraging finance so that we can actually use this for women entrepreneurs. If you look at the WTO right now, there is something going on gender in trade. It should be women in trade, in fact. And ITC, International Trade Center, already does a very successful sheet trade program in Africa generally. And we need to be able to see how the sheet trade program could incorporate a level of certification in their program. One of the proposals I've made, Sheila, and I share this with you, is that there's a lot of unpatented technology lying out there that is not being used. And we're trying to get ITC hopefully to work with WIPO. It's a conversation I've had with both, and to try and see whether we can get someone to use that unpatented technology and make it available to SMEs. Why do I say this to you is, I always use the example, a woman who sells peanuts in Africa doesn't have a clue about aflatoxin and couldn't care less. And she's not going to go and look for the response to aflatoxin in any case, unless you bring it to her. But it's a conversation, if you have with Pamela Cook Hamilton, she will tell you, you can actually go out and classify these kinds of technology available in the different sectors like manufacturing or environment or whatever. We need someone to distill that technology, make it simple, incorporate it into a program and make it happen. Our women will not go looking for that. I know it's a very simple thing to say, but I mean, to me, those are the responses. Let's find innovative ideas to be able to do that, to make certification something accessible for people. It's important. Without that, we can't trade. Thank you.
And Ambassador, one last question from the panel to you is, how do you see the opportunity to bring in more developing countries to exactly discuss these common questions of trade and environment into, say, the WTO structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability?
I'm sorry, I seem to have missed that because my earphone was off. Would you mind repeating it quickly?
Sorry, a question from the panel about how do you see the opportunity for more developing countries to come on board the WTO, structured discussions on trade and environment sustainability, to answer exactly some of the questions we've had to tackle in the panel?
Perhaps the easiest way to get people on board is to make sure that you're not coming to them and telling them that I'm going to be taking measures or imposing standards that exceed internationally agreed upon standards. What do we see in other places is that the moment your SPS measures go above what is accepted at Codex Alimentarius and elsewhere, it becomes difficult for people to agree to an issue. At the WTO, I think African countries and many other developing countries are just wary of having to pay the price of what has gone on before. So whilst we agree to common and differentiated responsibility, and we need to put people on board, the way you do that is constructing and not imposing fines and imposing measures. So you do partnerships like the EU partnership, but Sweden this afternoon is doing a big thing on the environment. And Sweden is one of those countries that can actually help. So you need people to come forward with real projects, financing the certification, helping people develop standards, and not saying to them, by the way, I'm putting one more barrier in your way for you not to be able to do trade. I know it doesn't directly go into the question, but you've got to bring a level of trust in the negotiations that allows people to say, this is for the common good. We need to do this, but we will still have the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. We will not bear all the burden ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of the panel, so we don't have time for more questions. I just wanted to conclude to saying, UNAP is working very closely with WTO to in fact answer many of the questions that we've discussed today. And we're hoping that at the country level, we'll see also the kind of environment and trade dialogue very much along what you all as panel members advised, is how do we work together in a mutually supportive manner to be able to really enhance trade opportunities, but that tackle questions of how to build better resilience in the continent and to take advantage of the opportunities there are for a green, bluer economy out there. So I'd like to close the panel discussion and thank all of you for the time you've spent engaging with us, and looking forward to working with you all on this partnership approach going forward. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.